Hi, everyone. My name's Randy Bell. I'm the Director of Business Strategies at the Global Energy Center. I'm playing the role of Ambassador Morningstar today, our founding director and chairman. He is traveling, and he wishes he could be here, but he says hello, and he's actually on vacation in Europe and is having more fun than we are. I talked to him 10 minutes ago, so I can confirm that. We're very pleased to welcome you all here for a conversation about Dr. Robert Eichhorn's new report on the critical role of China in post-Paris implementation. And this is the latest in a series of reports we're working on transforming the power sector in developing countries. We have copies of the report outside, I believe. Is that correct, Gray? And do we have the first report as well? It would be great to let's grab the first report as well. That's sort of the framework report, which if you haven't read is very, very interesting. This is a really crucial topic. It's in the news a lot right now because we're in the critical implementation, first part of the implementation stages of the Paris Agreement. And China has just today even reaffirmed its commitment to Paris, which is particularly interesting given the U.S. context, and that might actually, we'll talk about this I'm sure later, but help with the U.S. Commitment to Paris as well. So we have some great panelists here today, and I'm going to introduce you to them now, and they'll get started. I just want to remind you that this is all on the record and is live streaming, so the camera back there is going directly to the internet. Don't say anything you'd be embarrassed by. So I'd like to welcome our panelists. First, we have Jonathan Elkind, former Assistant Secretary for International Affairs at the U.S. Department of Energy. Prior to joining the Department of Energy, he worked as a senior fellow at the Brookings Institution, where he focused on energy security and foreign policy. He's also served on the National Security Council and was the National Security Affairs staff of the Vice President in the Clinton administration. We have Clara Gillespie, Senior Director of Trade, Economic, and Energy Affairs at the National Bureau of Asian Research, where she leads the Energy Security Program and the Pacific Energy Summit. She has substantial experience in Sino-U.S. energy security issues, which have included working for the American Chamber of Commerce in the People's Republic of China. We have Bob Eichhorn, who is currently a non-resident senior fellow at the Atlantic Council, the Global Energy Center, and he's CEO of Eichhorn Ventures, LLC. You should hire him. He has a distinguished 40-year career in the U.S. government working on international energy security, development, and climate change issues. And then finally, we're pleased to welcome our newest non-resident senior fellow, Charles Ebinger. He most recently served as the director of the Energy Security and Climate Initiative at the Brookings Institution, and he has over 30 years of experience advising the highest levels of government on various energy topics. We're so glad that he's here today, and we are so glad that he's part of the Atlantic Council family now. So again, this is all on the record, and over to the panelists. Please join us on stage.
Well, it's the afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. It's my great pleasure not only to be here in my first capacity with the Atlantic Council, but to be able to moderate a panel of such distinguished individuals. And in the case of our primary speaker, Bob Eichhorn, it's particularly interesting because for much of Bob's career, I served as an outside independent consultant on a number of projects where Bob was actually my boss. We won't ask him to make any comments about the quality of the work on any of those projects, but we are delighted to be here. I think the topic we have here today is, of course, one of the most vital on the international agenda. It's almost become passé to say, you know, the world succeeds or fails on climate change policies, depending on what China primarily, but secondarily India, a country that I personally have a great deal of experience, do or do not do to combat their own growing emissions of CO2 and other toxic elements into the atmosphere. But I think the format we'll do today is I'll turn the podium over in just a minute to Bob, and he'll make some introductory remarks about his paper, and then we'll have a moderated discussion among the panelists, but we want to make sure that we save lots of time for questions from the floor, because I know there are many people in the room very familiar and knowledgeable about different aspects of this issue. So without further ado, I'll turn it over to Bob.
Thank you very much, Charlie. It's great to be here. Thank everyone for coming today. And let me make a few brief comments to introduce the report. I don't want to go on too long. I want to just highlight a few things that I think might be useful for our discussion. First, I want to thank Ambassador Morningstar and the Global Energy Center for supporting this project that I've embarked on in my retirement from the State Department, and to my colleagues today for joining me on the panel to discuss this very important topic. You know, since I left State about a year ago, I focused on the issues related to implementation of the Paris Agreement, which was truly historic. And I think that, you know, focusing on the developing countries, because even though I'm biased, having worked with aid and development issues for so many years, I feel that it's really critical to keep our eye on what's happening in those regions from a foreign policy, from a global economic and environmental standpoint. You know, the IEA projects that 90% of future electricity growth is going to be in the non-OECD and the developing countries now into 2040. I mean, these are the markets of the future, and the choices that those countries make with regards to their energy mix are going to have fundamental importance to our global economy and environment. And so I think in the report, my first report laid out a framework for various actors in terms of how to address the power sector transformation issue. And the power sector is not the only sector, but it's one of the fastest growing, if not most fast growing sector. It's going to be critical to the industrial and modernization process in these countries. Obviously, we've seen how important it is in stability issues such as in Iraq and places like that. And so I think that now I'm moving on to apply this framework to key countries, and I decided, I think with some trepidation, to take on China as the first countries to apply it to. But clearly Asia is critical, because of that growth in the future, probably two-thirds is going to be in Asia, with China being a third or so. So it's really obviously going to be a determining factor with regards to global emissions and energy market development. And so my basic premise is that the power sector's transformation process is a highly political process, and governments face really difficult decisions, political and economic as well as environmental, in terms of moving toward cleaner, more efficient power systems. So the China report, I mean, there's a lot of work that's been done on China. And I'm not an expert on China. I've worked with China, but I'm not an expert, a scholar on China. You studied in Beijing, so Clara will correct me here. You know, I mean, you know, China is obviously superlatives, right? Second largest economy, largest power system, largest emitter, largest coal producer, largest oil importer, largest, you get the picture, largest increment in 2015 of global energy demand. So obviously, it's clearly the elephant. This report is a very modest effort to synthesize some of the material work that's been done. And it's oriented toward policy suggestions or reinforcing certain elements of the Chinese policy framework. I have not tackled the issue of U.S. policy toward China in this paper, other than to say, listen, there are many reasons, forget climate, why we should engage with China in this sector, and I hope we can come back to that. So there are four things that I want to highlight. There are many things in the report that I'd like to talk about, but for now, let me focus on four. The first relates to energy demand and the changing structure of the Chinese economy. I mean, clearly, we've seen this process beginning, how fast and what the implications are, but services are increasing as a part of the GDP. You know, it's very energy-intensive economy and dominates electricity, and heavy industry and secondary industry dominate energy consumption. But, you know, it's shifting. Urbanization is also an important driver, with projections of moving from 50 to 70% urban by 2040 at least. You know, buildings become really important in this regards. Demand is very uncertain, but it's going to grow. You know, 2015, because of the slowdown in industry, the reported statistics were that electricity growth only grew 0.5%, with GDP of 6.7%. Doesn't make sense to me, but you know. So they corrected the numbers this year. So now they're saying this year it was 5% electricity growth. But 5% is a lot of demand. And even their projections are not that the growth is going to be less than that in the future, but let's say at least 4%. Okay, so energy efficiency and the demand side become very important in terms of how this plays out. Second, of course, is environmental crisis, and obviously we've read how serious that is throughout the country. And I think that politically, there's the leadership, and we've seen it in our discussions with NEA and NDRC over the last 5 years, is they really have increased their focus on environmental issues, and I think real political imperative to address the environmental question. You know, part of it, and John, you'll remember this from Eastern Europe and our work in Poland and Katowice, et cetera. I mean, a lot of it is the low emissions. The use of coal in inefficient, polluting boilers in the cities. And that's a big problem. We were working on with DOE on that when I left. And I think that you know, substitution of gas is one of the key approaches to dealing with that, just like the Poles did. They're doing it in power plants. They're doing it in small boilers. They've got a work plan that's sort of aiming at 4 or 5 million people this year to substitute for low coal. So I mean, I think there's also obviously broader policy issues related to emissions trading, and we'll come back to that. I take the step in the paper of advocating that they really should look at the carbon tax approach. You know, and there's some voices that are saying that, and the IMF has obviously done analysis on the effectiveness of a carbon tax. Third, quickly, surplus capacity. You got to deal with the surplus capacity issue from an economic and political side. You know, that has increased as a result of the slowdown and the transition policies, the increasing of the non-coal. But you've got capacity utilization in the power sector of 50% in 2015, and it projected even lower in 2016. So huge excess capacity. We've all seen the plans to you know, in terms of reduction of coal mine, the closure of all coal mines, but also the opening of new coal mines and expansion in the western areas, which raises the question of basically just shifting pollution to the west. And so they're looking, obviously NEA and NDRC are issuing these directives to the provinces, to halt plants, to delay plants, to retire plants, you know, but there's tension in that relationship. And I think that that's going to be interesting to see. I mean, I look at this, and I recently resaw the movie Unstoppable with Denzel Washington. I don't know if you remember that movie. It's about where he's trying to stop this runaway train before it gets to the Bend in Scranton. And I sort of think, okay, here's this massive system, used to adding all this coal capacity. And you know, between 2010 and 2016, China added 679 gigawatts of power. The U.S. installed capacity is 1,000 gigawatts. 5 years, 6 years. Incredible. So you've got this whole system, and you've got now tremendous surplus engineering and capacity, et cetera. And coal was still the largest increment last year, even though renewables, including especially solar, outdid hydro in terms of the new additions last year. So, but this whole issue has to be addressed with because it's holding up the reforms. It's holding up the rationalization of the system. Fine point is the surplus is also, I think, driving more. It has been a factor driving an overseas policy. You know, we started with the Go Global policy in 1999, and then now the Belt Road Initiative and the Asian Infrastructure Bank and all these efforts, and the increased capitalization of the policy banks, the Export-Import Bank and the China Development Bank. And they're financing billions of dollars of projects. And you know, coal, yes, in Asia, but also nuclear and hydro and renewables, et cetera. So, I mean, they're actually, I think now, and Dion, you're here, but the World Bank, I mean, it's even dwarfing the World Bank's financing in some of these areas now in terms of their things. So I think these are only some of the issues, but hopefully that will help stimulate some discussion and give you a sense as to some of the issues I've addressed in the report. So thanks, Darren.
Thank you, Bob. Very strong summary and a timely summary as well. Thank you. As I was rereading your first report by the Atlantic Council, and as one who has worked with you closely in a lot of these countries on restructuring of power sectors, I couldn't help but think, it all sounds great. You know, we all know what we've advised people to do around the world. Unbundle your generation, transmission, distribution, establish independent regulation, try to get cost-reflective tariffs, which seldom seems to work, and the whole hodgepodge of things that I think is the best elucidated paper that I've seen really reviewing what we tried to do in all these countries, including in China. But as I sat back and thought about my own experience in these countries, I'm not sure any of that, for the most part, has worked. I think too often, with all due respect to people here in the development community from the bank or elsewhere, I think too often, if we could get a presidential decree or even a law that says we now have an independent regulator, that box was checked without any thought about what it really means to establish a body of case law, a situation where people have reasonable expectations that precedents by earlier decisions by regulators will be honored down the road. And I couldn't help, and I think the biggest problem why a lot of these things never are implemented, in addition obviously to political will and some real social blockages in terms of throwing thousands of people out of work, is the lack of human and institutional capacity. And when I read your China paper, I feel somewhat the same way. I mean, we know that there are bitter disputes between the central government in Beijing and the planning authorities, often with regional or local planning authorities. To the extent, at least as I read it, and I'm certainly not a China energy expert by any stretch of the imagination, but as I read it, it's not clear to me that the central government has enough control. And with growing concerns about pollution in the big cities, I know my China colleagues, while I was at Brookings, believe very strongly that pollution represents the greatest threat to the stability of the Communist Party more than any other threat. Obviously, other China experts may agree or disagree with that statement. So I just caution as we go through your checklist of things China needs to do, that some of these things that we know may have been done on paper in other countries still really aren't reality. And I think, for example, you know, when we started reforms in Pakistan, when we started reforms in India, you know, they're still arguing about these things from the 80s and the 90s.
Right.
You know, we're talking about 25 years plus that in many cases little or nothing has happened. And to expect that China will be across the board any more significant in this in terms of the timetable, that somehow they'll be able to jumpstart and have great regulation and cost-reflective tariffs in a few years, because of course cost-reflective tariffs are one of the major things that will bring down energy consumption and reduce CO2. I think we just have to be a little guarded. But let me throw out a couple questions for the panel to get us going. I'm sorry I went on too long on that spiel. I guess I know you say it's not part of your paper, and fair enough, but I guess what does all this mean for U.S. energy policy, particularly as we see a number of companies talking about making major inroads into the energy efficiency market in China, but we've got a president of the United States that says, you know, we don't want those jobs to go over to China. We don't want those technologies to go to China. We want to build them here. So how do we stop falling off a cliff in that fundamental debate about what energy efficient industries and other energy industries can go to China without incurring the wrath of the White House? Any of you want to?
Well, I'll take I'll offer the first darned if I know response. It does seem to me, Charlie, that that the current moment, which is so full of different energy-focused U.S.-China points, really is one in which I think that there is a strong question as to whether some of the established points of leadership are going to continue. Whether one is talking about clean energy and climate, which, according to most of the world, remains a huge set of priorities, whether one is talking about trade, by which one helps to address those issues in clean energy and climate. I think it is these questions are very much out there. And look, yes, we're meeting today in the very same week that President Trump announced his intention to withdraw from the Clean Power Plan, to remove the social cost of carbon, at least in the form that it was applied by the administration that I was working for, to restore coal, as he has said, although lots of questions have been raised in the industry as to whether self-interested companies that want to profit maximize will go in that direction, given the low cost of highly competitive domestically produced natural gas and wind and solar that last year outcompeted every other new source of generation in the United States. So there are lots of questions here. What's not ambiguous is that our Chinese friends clearly see a moment of opportunity, and President Xi Jinping's reaffirmation of China's intent to comply with its nationally determined contribution from the Paris Climate Agreement. The statement then yesterday by the visiting European Union Commissioner on Energy and Climate Action, Miguel Arias Cañete, that the EU and China together are ready to lead on climate. I think this kind of draws out the fact that we may be marching in a direction that is counter to where the job growth is actually happening globally, namely in the clean energy space. We may be marching in a direction that is counter to where many of our global competitors and partners are going. And so this raises some real difficult questions that we're going to have to deal with as a nation. You know, China is positioning itself to capture a huge share of what the IEA projects will be a $60 trillion market in aggregate by 2040, and that's in the clean energy and efficiency space. So I think we have to take very seriously that we've got a pretty seminal moment right now for where we go. Now, that's a long-winded way of responding to your question, Charlie, but I want to highlight one further piece, which I think is comes out in Bob's report and is very, very important, both in terms of what China wishes to do for its own domestic priority purposes, for its own self-interested reasons, but that also applies to all of what we might discuss as we try to figure out China's trajectory in relation to energy. And that is the need for better data published on a regular basis, broadly available, timely, and accurate data about the energy sector. It is a fundamental need in the case of China. Bob mentioned the scale of the achievements, and they are huge, that China has realized in the last years, and its scale of ambition in terms of growth of its clean energy economy going forward is no less considerable. But in order for Chinese policymakers and market participants, be they domestic market participants or foreign market participants, in order for any of those people to know whether those objectives are being reached, where the fastest, where the slowest, where opportunities may lie, where vulnerabilities lie for the decision makers in China, there needs to be a much improved, much increased focus on the availability, accuracy, and timeliness of Chinese energy data.
Claire, do you want to add anything?
I would completely agree with everything that John said, and maybe to add to that as well. For the U.S.-China bilateral relationship, we've often struggled with issues of distrust or mistrust, with trying to figure out where there are these stories of trade that has mutual benefits, of thinking about our own domestic aims first, even before we think about where we can build together, and then also issues such as IP theft. And there's a powerful existing story to highlight on the way that the United States and China have worked together on energy cooperation that can support those dual goals of economic growth, as well as transitions to more sustainable energy futures. One that comes immediately to mind is the Clean Energy Research Center, where the United States have worked together quite robustly through universities, through government partnerships, found ways to collaborate on new technologies, on the establishment of greater standards for energy efficiency. We've talked about if there are opportunities for us to do more on natural gas, and I think that should be a very positive story for the Trump administration, one area that's worth looking at in terms of trade. And then also I'm reminded that the IEA, when they released their most recent coal market outlook report, they had almost kind of a footnote level comment in the press release. The big thing that got attention was kind of this flat outlook for the market. But the footnote almost said, P.S., when we talk about Paris Climate Accord commitments, the one area we're really falling short, where we haven't seen that global leadership, is on clean coal technology. We really need to see more momentum there, more investment, more R&D. I think that should be a positive story for both countries. That's by no means an easy topic. CCS, other clean coal technologies have struggled significantly. Number one reason we often say cleaner coal rather than clean coal. But I think it is an interesting area where we might explore cooperation and not necessarily move away from some of our commitments.
Bob, one of the things that bothers me is we look at some of the Chinese goals, and they're very ambitious, as you're all saying, but particularly in energy efficiency and that, 2020 or 2022, we're supposed to more or less see peak demand. When you look at the fact that the Chinese population is still growing, albeit much slower, but particularly when you look at the 200 plus cities of 1 million people or more that are planned, and there's talk of building high-speed rail links and road links between these new cities, as well as with the existing metropolises, particularly in eastern China. I just don't understand how you can build that kind of infrastructure. And as you said, Bob, in your paper, all the commercial buildings and other things associated with that kind of growth, and not with the use of steel, cement, everything that goes into building that infrastructure, not see demand continue to rise quite precipitously. Do you have those concerns? Do you think the Chinese are being too ambitious? Will the Chinese meet those goals? Or do you think this is just a goal, and push ahead and get as quick or as close to those goals as we can, but if they have to be abandoned down the road, they will be?
Well, I don't have a crystal ball, but on the other hand, I have seen the Chinese, when they put their mind to something, that they can mobilize a lot of effort. But you're right in the sense that income, it's still, per capita income is still 11,000 PPP. So you've got tremendous, and this is sort of the dilemma I think that the country faces. It's a historic sort of tension between the imperative on economic growth and improving prosperity on one hand, and maintaining control in this big, diverse country on the other hand. So I think that there's a lot that they're trying to do in terms of directives, but I think that what your point is, I think the municipal and the provincial is really critical here. And I was just saying, I don't know how many of you saw the sort of the advertisement on Shenyang, moving from sunset industries to new innovative hubs of development. So there's a lot going on at the local level to try to develop this new economy. And hopefully it will be a more efficient economy and bring in new technologies. And there's a lot, I think to some extent there's more attention on energy efficiency in China than there is in a lot of countries. And that's very positive. But on the other hand, and as I said, companies like Johnson Controls, who we work with, are opening up new offices to try to tap that market. GE just signed a new big agreement for a gas power conversion of a coal plant to gas. So I think you're going to have this demand growth. I'm not sure. The numbers are questionable, but let's say if you have 5 to 6, at least 5 to 6 GDP growth, you're going to have increases in energy demand. 3, 4, 5% are not unrealistic over the next 20 years.
Charlie, I wonder if I could come in on that.
Sure.
I think that there's a key word that Bob used there, which is the tension between different policy objectives. And I do think that it's hard to foresee that further level of infrastructure build without an exacerbation or a sustaining of the urban air quality problems, unless you see some really considerable gains in terms of industrial energy efficiency. And that is very much in the crosshairs of what our Chinese counterparts, when I was in government service, indicated that they're interested to be focusing on. So I think that the emphasis that Bob gave in his opening remarks and in the report to the political salience of the environmental quality threats, the air quality threats, and water quality, frankly, across China, but especially in the big cities, I think that is right, and I think that's going to drive, in part, some of the efficiency gains that I think many energy people in China and elsewhere would wish for them to be able to achieve.
Charlie, one other point that came out recently, I think, which we're seeing in other developing countries too, as they modernize, as they urbanize, is that you've got this strong demand, that's certainly in many areas of China, for air conditioning. And so the peak load on this power system from the buildings and all the air conditioning, et cetera, is a big factor. Peak load increased 19% last August when it was hot. And and so you also need a different kind of power system there to deal with that. And that's why I think, I've been supportive of not only the transition to renewables, but also the role that gas can play in providing more flexibility and meeting those huge peaks, the growing peaks that are occurring in the power system.
On the subject of natural gas, since you raised it, how do you feel? What do you think the Chinese authorities feel on the trade-off between more LNG imports, more pipeline imports, including, of course, some huge deals, some underway, some still talked about, with Russia and some of the other neighbors? Do you think they'll try to push on all fronts more LNG and more pipeline gas, as well as, of course, coal bed methane and other alternatives?
From what I've seen, they'll definitely push on all fronts, but relative to what I would have expected maybe 5-6 years ago, there's less of a priority emphasis on pipelines and more expectation that LNG will play an increasingly significant role. And that has to do with fundamentally how the market has changed in that time in terms of suppliers you have coming online, not just from Russia, but from Australia, United States, and Canada as well. And the sense that if what was driving China's natural gas priority goals before was this concern about import dependence or over-reliance or the geopolitics of gas, there's much less immediate pressure or concern there.
I know there was a lot of interest early on, of course, that China could be a huge export market for the United States for LNG, but it seems as if with the changes in the LNG market, you find more and more LNG producers in the United States really saying that Europe will be the primary market for U.S. exports. I was wondering if you have any feeling about that.
I think obviously it's exciting to see what's happening in the gas world internationally. You know, there was just an announcement the other day that the Chinese and Japanese and Koreans that account for 50% of the LNG trade are going to work together to try to get more flexible contracts in a market that they perceive where they have some leverage given the supplies that are anticipated to be on the market. You know, but I think, and it is clear that at least in the near term, there has been an increase in the spot prices in Asia, which had dropped to a level that made it not as attractive for Cheniere and others to market in those areas. So I think the last I looked that Japan was $9 or $10 or something like that. So, you know, and depending on what happens here with gas prices, that's not an unreasonable spread in terms of being able to look more toward the Asian market. But you have other competition in the Asian market too. And so how this market framework develops in terms of Singapore as a hub or others in terms of, and how much the companies want to move towards spot purchases as opposed to long-term contracts is an interesting question. I mean, I think that what you've seen in China and what people are worried about is to some extent that demand hasn't grown as quickly as anticipated. And yet you have all these efforts, one to increase pipeline capacity to 100 BCM by 2020. You've had, 11 LNG terminals built and 6 more under construction. So you've got a tremendous effort to try to develop that as a source. It's still embryonic, and it still, to some extent, looks like it'll be focused on coastal cities where you can develop the imports and the infrastructure to substitute for the plants and industries in that area, and as I said, the heating systems. And so I think so that policy and the pricing aspects of that have been very important in influencing. First, they had higher prices to try to encourage upstream development. Then they had lower prices to try to encourage consumption. I think gas right now is a small player.
Yeah, very small.
And I think, they want to increase it to 10% from 4 or 5 now. So. And so I think that, but there's certainly going to be the import capacity. How much they want to become dependent upon imports, and how much, I mean, I didn't deal at all with the upstream issues, and others may want to comment on that, but because obviously they have gas resources, but there are a lot of constraints, and companies have found that it's been very difficult to try to enter into agreements to develop the shale capacity or other capacity in China, and so I think that remains a big question, but it's a very important question because I happen to think that in the diversification strategy, gas has a critical role, and it can lead to a faster reduction of emissions than if you only went with the non-fossil options alone, given some of those constraints that operate on these other sources. Yeah, so I think it's probably and it's an area. I mean, I often sort of visualize or talk about a vision where saying, okay, U.S., Canada, Mexico. If we could only work together and work with Asia to try to look at developing a broader framework for export of gas to Asia to try to begin to bend that coal curve, you could have a tremendous relationship of mutually beneficial from an economic and environmental standpoint, and reduce their dependence on the Middle East, because you have to remember Asia is primarily an importer and is becoming more and more dependent on the Middle East for oil and gas.
Can I add to that?
Please.
I mean, thinking about your comments as well, I think the IEA just came out with a statement, a report recently that said in so many words, both the present and the future of LNG demand are in Asia. And this year in particular, we've started to see some U.S. exports to Asia come online, to Japan and others. But I think fully realizing that potential, and perhaps in some cases why it's discounted as well, raises real questions about the future of U.S. policy and how we might shape it. U.S. natural gas exports in particular are defined by a law that has a very complex process for both approval and permitting, and also determining when and how natural gas exports are in the U.S. national interest, which was no easy conversation to go through a number of years. Is national interest about, okay, the economic potential that gas could play? Is it about the environmental benefits? Is it about environmental concerns? Is it about tensions between domestic industries as well? Some who want to have cheaper gas here rather than have cheaper gas in kind of a global picture. That's a question that is up for debate right now. There are certain things we can do to further accelerate the pace of exports, but really thinking about this policy in particular could play a more significant role in addition to some of the infrastructure questions. And then also, I think for U.S. industry and others, there is a question about the demand outlook. We've seen a lot of variable numbers in the region, seen a lot of very bold statements about goals and importance and priorities, but not necessarily always that same realization. Some individuals, some analysts have hoped that 1 or 2 countries might be able to drive that significant demand that makes it viable. Others, Leslie Palti-Guzman for NPR, wrote a piece saying that what we're most likely to see in this market in Asia is more this coalition of smaller suppliers that in aggregate will kind of bundle up to what would make those exports possible. But again, when you have a US policy that says you either have to be a free trade country or otherwise go through this process, those are questions that we need to address before we can immediately realize that potential.
John, you wanted to?
Yeah, I'd just like to come in with a couple of comments here. First of all, I mean, I think that it is important to remember the scale and the dynamism right now in global natural gas markets. We're in a 5-year period where we're going to see something like a 40% increase in the liquefaction capacity around the globe. And so it is a really good time to be a natural gas buyer and importer for the next period of time. The second point, I think it is important to look at the actual experience of what has happened in terms of approvals for exports of LNG from the United States. It is true that the Department of Energy, when the first questions of exports started to come along, had to contend with how do you actually implement faithfully the Natural Gas Act, which goes back to the beginning of last century when LNG, cryogenic transportation of super chilled natural gas could only have seemed like science fiction out of somebody's creative mind, but is now so central in the natural gas economy. Nonetheless, after the kind of growing pains, the actual record is that something north of 12 BCFD, 120 billion cubic meters per year-ish, have been approved, and it could be more. I haven't looked at the record actually in the last about 6 weeks. That establishes the United States, assuming that all of the export facilities then actually are completed and commissioned, that establishes the United States as a major natural gas exporter and a part of that massive growth. So although there is a rather curious quality to the notion of, particularly under the current policy debates, thinking about FTA versus non-FTA countries, which is the threshold that is used in the Natural Gas Act. Nonetheless, the fact is that we're going to be a big part of the supply bulge that's in the global markets, and that ought to give confidence, frankly, to natural gas users everywhere. The last comment that I'll make that takes us back to the framing of Bob's report, namely the post-Paris implementation, is that how that natural gas gets used, namely what that natural gas is an alternative to. Does it back out coal burning, or does it back out some other sources, renewables? If the latter, then it's a net loser for climate. If it's the former, then it's a net big winner.
We're running out of time before we go to the audience, but I would like to get into one area, well, two areas. One is the whole question of Chinese export policy on coal. If the Chinese, and I've heard people argue that even the One Belt, One Road has big plans to help the Kazakhs get their tremendous coal resources into the world market. A lot of people don't realize that Kazakhstan, on a BTU basis, their coal reserves dwarf their oil and gas reserves. But what do you think about how China can profess to be moving vigorously towards climate change positive policies at home, and yet through their new infrastructure bank and other things Bob talks about, are in reality helping to build more coal plants overseas? And a final question is, what do you think, are you optimistic that the plans for nuclear power will be achieved? I mean, just this week we saw Westinghouse go bankrupt, Toshiba Westinghouse. And do any of you have concerns that if China does move vigorously ahead, as they're talking about, and becomes a sizable exporter themselves of nuclear reactor technology, do we have any non-proliferation concerns in the sense, will China put on the same kinds of controls that the traditional vendors have? Anybody want to?
Who are you tapping for those? Bob?
You're the experts.
Oh, okay. All right. Do you want to start, Bob?
Yeah, I'll say a few words. I mean, obviously, the involvement of China in Asia, but also increasingly in Africa. IEA just recently did a very nice study on China's involvement in Africa. Has focused traditionally in the power sector on hydro and on coal. Huge investments and financing for coal plants in Indonesia, and a lot of the equipment for India's coal developments come from China. They're now sort of have been recently, in the last couple of years, been focusing on developing coal plants that will use imported coal from Indonesia. Pakistan and Malaysia and Philippines, places like that. So I think one of the big questions, I mean, there was a dialogue on this issue in the Obama administration, in the context, our broader context of working with OECD and countries and other countries to try to limit support, public support for coal-fired plants. And there was, this certainly was part of the dialogue with China and in terms of trying to phase out that support. I think to some extent we have to look at how One Belt, One Road also evolves here. There is a range of projects that are being developed, including this coal project in Pakistan, that to some extent run a little bit counter to some of the Chinese public statements, I think, that they're going to focus more on environmentally friendly and cleaner options for that approach. I mean, obviously, the infrastructure aspects and the arguments they use in terms of trying to reduce the transit time of goods to Europe, et cetera, is an important driver of their thinking about this initiative. But and clearly they have stepped up their financing for renewables around the world, in Latin America, in Africa, and in Asia. So you're seeing positive signs with regards to their involvement in that area. I think that involvement is not without its difficulties, as we've seen with regards to the large hydro projects and some environmental and other concerns about their environmental and political implications of some of these mega projects that they're doing.
Thinking about the question of coal, most often the narrative that I hear on Chinese policies is that China is disproportionately represented in global coal financing, which is undeniably true for a number of reasons. But there's this complementing narrative that almost seems to suggest it's because China is going out and selling coal or encouraging others to not do coal. And when I think about Indonesia and others, I don't know that I've seen the statement that would back the idea that if not for China, Indonesia would not do coal, unless we're saying potentially that Indonesia then might do more diesel, which is an even worse scenario. I mean, when I think about Indonesia in particular, it has very dramatic ambitions to increase its renewable energy portfolio. Significant targets for natural gas, could be higher, but still requires significant commitment. And coal demand is still expected to grow exponentially, and that's just a factor of how big the gap is in terms of their current electrification rates. Now, that being said, one of the reasons why China is so disproportionately represented has to do with other global policies, the United States, Japan, and others who have in recent years either curtailed or eliminated their own financing. When AIIB put out its most recent round of its kind of draft proposal on what its clean energy financing would look like, I think it was encouraging that they are trying to think seriously about the fact that while many countries envision coal playing a significant role in their energy mix, it should undeniably be cleaner. They've gotten a number of pushback on their rounds of what that coal financing might look like. It'll be interesting to see how that develops, if it'll be ultra supercritical, or if there'll be a certain threshold or standard that's met to be able to demonstrate, yes, China, we agree that there are some cases where the financing you provide will bring up what would otherwise be a lower environmental threshold, but really here's the threshold that you have to meet. I think that's still an open question.
John, you want to take the next?
I want to come back to the nuclear aspect.
We need to answer quickly.
Yes, quickly. Yeah, I mean, obviously, this ambitious nuclear program is interesting in the sense that it really is putting on plants at a very rapid rate, and some of those have been delayed. There have been problems with regards to equipment quality control, and there is, in a sense, certainly some statements that say the government recognizes the need to strengthen the safety regime with regards to nuclear power. There's also colleagues that I have that are concerned about the longer-term development of such a huge nuclear industry with regards to plutonium and proliferation concerns. So I think we'll have to watch that carefully. I mean, I think that the other thing that came up recently was the fact that while there are 3 major groups that are involved in these plants, there are new entrants that are trying to get into that nuclear business that don't have the experience. But I think internationally it is clear that they're looking at really substantial expansion of the nuclear involvement. You've seen that in Argentina. You've seen it also in the contracting for CANDU plants in Argentina and in Romania, for instance, completing the Cernavodă plants. And so I think it's interested in markets like South Africa and places like that where they're still looking at putting in major nuclear capacity. But the cost and whether they can really drive, through some of their indigenous design, drive down the cost, because now you've got such changes in cost structure with regards to both gas and renewables that it doesn't look that attractive from a pure economic policy standpoint.
I want to thank the panelists. We'll now move to the floor. May I first say, please identify yourself, and please ask a question and ask it succinctly. Thank you. All right, we'll start over here. And there are mics, so please wait till you get a mic.
Thank you. Thank you very much. My name is Paolo von Schirach, President of the Global Policy Institute. Thank you very much for this great overview of Tour d'Horizon on what's going on in China and beyond. Here's the question. The official rhetoric is China, green power, America sliding back because of policy changes and all the things you've already mentioned. However, the hard realities are this. We consume our coal reliance for power generation now is down to about 30%, largely thanks to fracking, which has nothing to do with climate change concerns or anything else. It's business. China reliance on coal down from 85 to what, 75 now? Am I correct? 75, is that approximately
Like 60.
Correct? Actually, the generation this year was 65
Well, but in terms of installed capacity.
in installed capacity, right?
Yeah. All right. How long is it going to take China to go down to 30%? 200 years? That's my real question. It's a real question. In other words, the rest is rhetoric. They can say whatever they want. And indeed, there's been huge progress in terms of new installed capacity in China in renewables, which is fantastic in absolute terms. In relative terms, modest. And the fact is, China relies on coal at the moment. That's the hard fact. They may be trending in a different way, but I would like to ask you, how long is it going to take?
Why don't we take another question here, and then you can answer them both.
Alden Meyer, Union of Concerned Scientists, thanks for this. I wanted to ask about the U.S.-China dynamic in this space, the strategic economic dialogue, the bilateral initiatives on technology that we built with China over the last 10 years. What are the prospects for those given the shift in administrations? And then in a multilateral space, the U.S. really took the lead in creating Mission Innovation, the Clean Energy Ministerial. Secretary Moniz was really driving that. China is going to be hosting the next meeting of that in June.
Right.
And taking leadership, and then it goes to the European Union. Is the U.S. out of that game, given the budget proposals and the initiatives of this administration? Are we ceding that leadership to China and the EU?
Who wants to start?
So
Go
take
ahead.
the second. I'll go back to the first one. But,
Okay. Alden, thank you for the question. Look, this is, again, one of the darned if I know questions, just to be perfectly candid. There are abundant reasons why the new administration, with its own set of policy priorities, which I certainly personally think should include climate change as part of them, but if they decide to go in a different direction, that's notably their call, not mine. Nonetheless, if one's focus is job creation, economic competitiveness of the United States, familiarization with markets around the globe, part of this massive clean energy economy that is emerging at an increasingly rapid pace. If one wishes to go after those kinds of objectives, many of which I think fit in a way that may be much more comfortable for the new administration, then one would expect that continuing both some of the bilateral engagements on energy with China, and also continuing U.S. leadership in some of the multilateral engagements that you referred to would make a heck of a lot of sense. Yes, China will host on the 6th through the 8th of June the 8th meeting of the Clean Energy Ministerial and the 2nd Mission Innovation Ministerial meeting. These are, on the one hand, a clean energy deployment focus for Clean Energy Ministerial, and on the other, the mission innovation effort and over-the-horizon emphasis on the next generation of clean energy technologies. The skinny budget certainly doesn't hint at any friendliness toward energy R&D, or for that matter, many other forms of R&D. And it is clear from comments that have been made by Republicans on Capitol Hill that while they understand the expression of the president's priorities as appropriators, they will make the decisions about what the budgets look like ultimately. And I would just simply say in closing that through Republican and Democratic administrations, through Republican-led and Democratic-led Congresses, going back well into the middle of the last century, the United States has enhanced its economic position by continuing to support the innovation economy. And it is my hope that the new administration will continue with that long-standing, well-established, well-justified history of investments in our ability to innovate across this economy.
Paula, to your question on the time horizon here. So, as we said, demand growth will increase. Projection is for 2020 to cap, no, for 2020 for installed capacity an increase to 2,000 gigawatts from 1640 this last year. It's 350 gigawatts by 2020. I don't know. That seems a little bit high, but on the other hand, they're adding over 100 gigawatts a year. But the good news was that this year, 60% or more of the new capacity was non-fossil.
But they're still adding.
But they're adding coal. They want to cap coal at 1,200 gigawatts. I'm sorry, 1,100 gigawatts. Okay, so there's still room to increase that coal, and as I said, there is still new projects going on in some of the non-environmentally and non-surplus provinces in the West to develop coal plants out in that region, and I think that's part of the issue of the dynamic growth is that they're putting a lot of emphasis to try to increase the economic growth in those areas, and coal is being used because there's lots of coal out there too to develop. So I think, you know, while the goal is 55% reduction down to 55%, the IEA, some of the projections to 2040 have them going down to 40%. You're right in the sense that I think that's why your point about not only clean coal, but also CCS and some of these other technologies in the future may have a role. They're working on them. The economics don't particularly look great at this point, but obviously between now and 2030, 2040 is a long time, and there could be significant breakthroughs in that.
If I could, I'd like to kind of suggest that there's a connective tissue between the question that you posed, Paolo, and the one that Alden did. Through the established experience that we have of working with China on energy issues, there have often been points where they and we didn't quite see what the other was arguing for. This is one of those cases. How do you add up those sums and come up with the kind of future that we hope for China to achieve and that the Chinese leadership say that they wish to achieve? I don't have a crystal ball that gets me to that answer today, but it does, I think, strongly endorse, therefore, the importance of our continuing to roll up our sleeves and sit down and talk with them. These conversations between the United States and China on energy are at no particular time especially easy. They undoubtedly find us to be a vexatious bunch of people to deal with. There are times where we simply don't understand, as your question suggests, how you get to the stated objectives given what their trend lines are. That's why we need to work with each other.
Charlie, going back to your question, a comment about reforms and whether you can really implement reforms given the center-periphery relationship. I mean, I think many of us will said in our discussions with the Chinese, there is indeed, despite the nature of the communist system, some desire to try to open up the system to achieve reforms. There's certainly an interest in our experience in how we have tried to develop more market-oriented systems. And I think, further to John's point, I think that dialogue that we've had with FERC and with state and DOE on these issues is really important to try to begin to look at how can they really make some of these reforms work in a way that's going to open up the system. And that is, of course, facing the challenge that you have these huge state energy companies that dominate sectors. Even though there are new entrances that are coming in from different from private and even with some foreign capital and the prospects, of course, of trying to expand the green bond and the financial systems to allow more international financing can help to, I think, accelerate some of the diversification investments that are going to be pursued.
Yeah, maybe, I mean, going back to your original statement, almost how do we get that percentage lower than 65%? One of the things I think my colleagues have hit on is you can get it lower by just increasing everything else, which is not necessarily a statement on how you actually decrease coal demand. There are a wide number of ranges in China about what's actually possible in terms of that peak coal demand. And I've seen everything from, it could have already happened to it's going to happen in 2035, and that level is it's going to peak about where we're at now, or maybe it could almost even double. And that creates significant ambiguity in China's own energy planning. I mean, if we try to think about how we decrease it, one of the most helpful measures might be, well, let's look at others across the region and what really transformed their own reliance on coal. And for the United States, I mean, that was undeniably both the shale gas revolution coming on board and also these breakthroughs in the technological costs for wind and solar, of which China had a significant part. It's another case for why more R&D and kind of this attention to thinking about not just what we know now, but really wanting to push on innovation. To go to the mission innovation question, I would agree it's maybe too soon to tell. The plan that we've seen is a presidential wish list. He might not get everything. What's clear is that he does not necessarily wish for more spending on climate or as much on R&D as we might see possible. But if we think in real terms about what the US was committing to, it was quite significant. It's important. It matters in terms of global leadership and perspectives that we have skin in the game. But the numbers that we've been quoting in just terms of raw dollars, China and others in some ways were already more significant on their aid budget. The other reason you want the United States to be involved is not just as cash. You want us to be thinking about R&D for a US domestic audience. R&D in the United States does not just occur in one basement in the Department of Energy. It happens in labs, in universities, in facilities across the country. It happens in people's districts. And I think that really matters as we think about how Congress might lead on thinking through, what are the opportunities of some of this clean energy development for our own economic growth.
Okay, let's take a couple more. Let me just say, I hope we don't give them FERC. I think that would be the worst thing we could give the Chinese. Got a couple? Yes, ma'am.
Hi, my name is Yi. I'm a student at Johns Hopkins University School of Advanced International Studies. I'm from China, and one thing I've noticed is that there's a huge wind curtailment in China, and it's very difficult for the government to figure out how to bring them online. And I want to have your advice on what is the most efficient way in the state level, province level, government of Chinese government level, and then also on the international development level, what is the most efficient way in terms of solving that issue? Thank you.
Why don't we take two?
Hello, my name is Ruth Koo. I'm with the U.S. Department of State's Bureau of Energy Resources, and Bob was my former DAS in the energy transformation pillar, so it's very good to see him again. I actually am the lead on this China Power Sector cooperation that we're doing with the National Development Reform Commission. And I guess related also to this young lady's question, we are working on 3 pilots with the Chinese on opening up market, enhancing demand response, and increasing the local consumption of renewable energy, which is related to the wind curtailment issue. It does involve work with the provinces, so we are trying to make progress with the Chinese on these reforms. I guess one of the very interesting things is they are seeking to open up their market in interesting ways. And my question to you is, what would you recommend as an initial step to their opening up that market, given the dynamics in the current system? What are your thoughts along those lines?
Who wants to take?
Well, since I know where Ruth's coming from on this issue, so thank you, Ruth, for asking, and thank you for continuing to try to push the envelope on the market reform cooperation, because I think ultimately the answer to your question is you got to create a market. And that relates to, I mean, Charlie, our issues related to unbundling, opening up distribution, third-party access, bilateral contracts. I mean, they know all this stuff. The problem is, how do you change a system that has such vested interest in incumbent generators and others? And as the other young lady was saying, the increase in curtailment has doubled or so in the last couple of years. So there's both a transmission issue, and State Grid admits that. There's been a lack of planning for all this new generation capacity. There is the surplus capacity issue that I mentioned that has to be rationalized, because otherwise you're going to continually be faced with this issue of dispatch decisions at the local level, and the invested generators are going to, even though they have interest in renewables as well, are going to resist that. They want to keep the plants open and running at at levels that can, maintain the health of the company. I think that what I've said there is that I think you need to have more independent, if that's possible in China, regional centers. I mean, we moved toward RTOs, and you can debate whether RTOs have been successful in terms of our system. But you need some kind of a group at the more regional level that's really going to be able to plan and look independently at the regional system and how you can deploy those resources in a way, and that can't be dominated by the incumbent generators. So it is a market issue as well as a technical issue with regards to planning and how do you integrate these intermittent sources into the system. And as you know, the plans are for more and more wind and solar to come online, and the problem will be exacerbated. And the question is, will people want to invest if they can't dispatch their systems, especially if they're getting financing? I mean, right now we haven't really talked about the financial system, but the fact that the state banks have continued to issue these bonds and financing for companies, including the, quote, zombie companies and the unprofitable companies, to keep not only the industrial production going, but also these energy companies afloat. I mean, that's part of this equation that has to be dealt with in terms of getting some greater clamping down of the financial resources that are going to continue this train, as I was saying, to build new capacity.
Some more questions? Yes.
My name's Tom Altman. I've been with the coal industry for a long time.
Can you get the mic, please? Thank you.
My name's Tom Altman. I've been with the coal industry a long time, most recently with Arch Coal. Over the years, I've been very involved with DOE's efforts on coal R&D, which really went into a hiatus for years. We have U.S.-China energy cooperation in advancing coal technology. You look at the Paris Agreement, close to 30 countries' commitments included the continuing use of coal and using highly efficient new coal-fired power plants called ultra-critical. And they're being built and they're being financed by China, Japan, South Korea, and others in various countries around the world. That is one aspect of it, and now the United States appears that it may now also allow companies to build new coal-fired power that are more highly efficient, emit less carbon per unit of coal produced. That's one part of the question. Do you see that trend continuing? The second part of the question is, a while back there was a lot of advance on cooperation on coal gasification. And you look at China's situation, they have coal in the western region. They don't have the pipeline infrastructure to get natural gas from the east to the west. coal gasification with carbon capture, is there a focus in China on a future for that technology? And does could the U.S. play a role in in facilitating that?
So, first of all, let me say that the focus on continuing use of coal in a way that is consistent with climate change objectives is something that the Department of Energy under Ernie Moniz and Steve Chu spent a lot of time and a lot of effort and resources on. You alluded to the advanced coal technology work that was happening as a part of the U.S.-China Clean Energy Research Center. This was I think a pretty remarkable opportunistic use of capabilities that Chinese and U.S. researchers and companies, each of those two on both sides, could bring to the table. It was also a very clear indication of what Bob alluded to before, which is that the price points that you can see carbon capture at in the market today are not sufficiently compelling. But by the same token, if you look at the projections of how we get to the kind of climate outcomes that we seek of less than 2 degrees Celsius, it's pretty darn hard, if at all possible, to see how you do that without successful, that is cost competitive, carbon capture, utilization, and sequestration. So what have been the combinations that were so fortuitous? You had U.S. companies with technologies that they wanted to develop. They wanted to use platforms on existing power plants in China to test them. You had some of the reverse as well. Participation not only by West Virginia University, some of our major laboratories, including the National Energy Technology Laboratory, where there's a great deal of the national expertise on CCUS, but then also the big companies on both sides. So this is exactly an example of the kind of collaborations that I think are terribly important to move ahead with. And oh, by the way, one of the early areas of focus that we had envisioned under Mission Innovation, should the new administration elect to continue with this, was also focusing on some of the major scientific questions that are remaining in regard to CCUS. And that's a topic that was of interest to the European Union and to the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia alike. And so, great sense of importance and priority there. Yes, the previous administration did not support the use of government dollars to support coal-fired power plants other than A, in the least developed countries, B, with carbon capture. So that did have the effect of ruling out supercritical, and I think in the end, ultra supercritical was allowed to be covered. And that was a source of real frustration by a lot of folks in the coal community. I recognize that. China has been, I would say, rather inscrutable to me in terms of what their long-term plans are vis-a-vis coal gasification. In the absence of carbon capture, you're just moving the problem in a different form farther west in the country, and that's hard to see how that ends up being a long-term winner. Last comment, one area that has been a place of ambiguity, which I think might merit some reconsideration, is for existing coal fleets, take Ukraine, for example, take China, for example, for existing coal fleets where there are companies that, from the United States or elsewhere, that could come in and improve significantly the combustion efficiency of those plants. To me, that's kind of all win. And that might be an area where it makes sense to have a look at whether there is, that is an area that could be one of support. The place where this has bitten in terms of the policy debates is whether, in effect, you are prolonging the lifetime in some way of those subcritical coal plants. That's something that the new administration is going to have to work through and figure out in terms of priorities.
I think that it's clear that China sees the replacement of older plants with supercritical and ultracritical units as part of their strategy. And so I would say, as part of my overall suggestion, that they really need to look at how they effectively rationalize and move ahead. Let's assume that they do cap it at 1,100 gigawatts. You know, what mix of rehabilitation of new plants? How much can you retire? They want to retire several hundred gigawatts of old, inefficient capacity, and that, I mean, you know, it doesn't solve the problem, but it helps. If you can have 1,100 megawatts of supercritical as opposed to subcritical. And it also is very important, I think, in terms of the overseas, because a lot of the pot plants that built in Africa and Asia are subcritical. And now, you know, we insisted, even though we didn't particularly support it, in Pakistan, for instance, that they develop, you know, supercritical plants.
It might interest people to know that India had made a staunch commitment that in the 12th plan, 5-year plan coming up, that no plants, no coal plants that weren't supercritical or ultra supercritical would be built. They just last week rolled that back.
Oh, they did?
Because they basically stated they cannot expand their electricity sector fast enough to meet the needs of the unserved citizens at a reasonable cost if they do that. We have time for maybe 1 or 2 more questions. Please, succinct as possible, and answers as succinct as possible.
Thanks. Just a quick question. Rob Colorina, I'm with an investment group. You know, the topic of these international consortiums, particularly from the West, how does the topic of environmental compliance work out? Because you've got, you know, maybe rules within China or in some of the other emerging countries versus some of the compliance matters from the West.
Why don't we take the other question back, wherever that was?
Hi, thanks. Daniel Melling with World Resources Institute. There's a big shift in the labor market with coal miners being put out of jobs in China. Do you get a sense that the country is managing that effectively, and what are some of the political ramifications?
Any reaction?
Oh, I was going to say, on the labor market question, I was particularly impressed by your comments in the paper as well, which I completely agreed with, which it is this looming challenge. I mean, we can see the numbers, we can see the trajectory for what might happen, what is possible. And if we try to go around for really good examples or good messages, too often we say, well, we can just switch this energy source for that energy source, and we make the same comments about labor markets. You know, the people who are working in coal mining are not necessarily going into solar installation or production. I think it's still an area where we need to talk more significantly about what those mechanisms are. Is there comprehensive retraining programs? At what level does that occur? At what mechanism? A lot of people have talked about, okay, well, is it, you know, high schools or others? What is the access? I think it's still an open question that we have.
I'm glad you raised it, because on the social impact issues, because I think, obviously, you know, it's all politics is local. I mean, how is this going to impact the Northeast and those communities where they're closing down these things and greatly reducing the production from the industries as well? I mean, in the early, you know, at the time when they announced we're going to close 1,000 mines, there was, in a sense, an adoption of a policy to create a special fund to support the social adjustment process. I haven't seen so much about that in terms of how they're implementing or how they're providing support to local communities to do that. And it's a really critical issue, you would think. And you see in the paper here and there, I mean, that there are labor protests in these different local communities. And how significant is that? I mean, John and I know from Eastern Europe that the environmental community and some of the concerns about pollution was a major factor ultimately leading to the political change in those countries. But I don't think we can necessarily expect that in China, but I think that it is clearly, I think, an important political issue, especially as President Xi goes into the party Congress this autumn.
We've got 1 minute for the environmental compliance question.
I'm not entirely sure that I understood your question, but I'll just take a jump in. I mean, if your question is about Chinese companies operating overseas under One Belt, One Road or something like that, I think that the presumption is that they are complying with the local, the host country requirements. If I did not understand your question correctly, maybe we could talk afterward. Okay.
Yeah, I mean, there's not a lot, obviously there's not a lot of direct wholly owned investment in the energy sector by foreign companies.
Yeah.
But clearly there are standards, and the government is increasing, as I mentioned, there's a new law that's going to increase pollution taxes and things like that. I think internationally, one of the things that we tried to encourage, I mean, we had tried to encourage programs with the World Bank and Asian Development Bank and the African Development Bank with the Chinese so that they would apply international environmental standards to a lot of these large infrastructure programs.
Well, I'd like to thank the Atlantic Council and all our speakers for, I think, a very dynamic and interactive session. So please join